children and parents' responsibility. This was Bill Nye when he was on Larry King Live.
Bill, those in the United States who publicly claim no religious affiliation have risen considerably over the last 2 decades. This recent shift, does it affect the interest in science?
Well,
we go away from religion, do we go towards science?
I think what happens when you go towards science, you go away from religion. People get a lot out of religion. They get community. That's what people want.
And a feeling of something's coming.
And it's very hard to accept for many of us that when you die, it's over. That's really hard for a lot of people. But with that said, my concern has always been you can't use tax dollars intended for science education to teach something akin to the earth is 10,000 years old. And because that's just wrong. I mean, it's very much analogous to saying the earth is flat. Then you can show the earth is not flat. You can show the earth is not 10,000 years old. That's it. We're not teaching
that. So why
in
do they
school.
continue to believe it?
So apparently people with these deeply held religious beliefs, they embrace that whole literal interpretation of the Bible as written in English as a worldview. And at the same time, they accept aspirin, antibiotic drugs, airplanes, but they're able to hold these two worldviews. And this is a mystery.
It seems that view of a lot of people that really it's the community that's in charge of children, not parents.
We have never invested as much in public education as we should have because we've always had kind of a private notion of children. Your kid is yours and totally your responsibility. We haven't had a very collective notion of these are our children. So part of it is we have to break through our kind of private idea that kids belong to their parents or kids belong to their families and recognize that kids belong to whole communities. Once it's everybody's responsibility and not just the households, then we start making better investments.
Then you combine that with the idea that parents teaching their children Christian child abuse.
Recently in the United States, stated that teaching creationism is child abuse, and I think it is. Namely, if you withhold knowledge or you do anything to children that puts them at a competitive disadvantage, as adults, it's child abuse. It's mild forms of child abuse, but it's like withholding medicine, withholding knowledge that later on will cause kids to become less competitive because evolution is the basis of modern biology, and teaching things that are basically lies, even if they're well-intentioned, is child abuse. I mean, it's not that people are doing this to be evil, but they're hurting their children, especially, of course, telling kids they're going to go to hell. That's definitely child abuse. It is inappropriate. And teachers not only should not be doing this, but in fact, if they are, they should be removed, in my opinion, because the purpose of education, as I've often said, is not to validate ignorance, but to overcome it.
So that shows you some of the ideas we're struggling against. All right. I asked y'all last week if you think about what are the evidences for evolution. And if you look through your textbook, did y'all find anything? I think they say why you think evolution is true. What they offer is proof. Okay. Similarities in different creatures, plants, even. Anything else? Here comes Ethan. I'm sure he's got all the answers. All right, let's look at Jonathan's textbook from last year and see what it says about the evidences for evolution. It says, since Darwin's time, scientists have found a great deal of evidence that supports the theory of evolution. Fossils, patterns of early development, similar body structures, which you were talking about, similarities in the DNA and protein structures, all provide evidence that organisms have changed over time. So as we look at those, kind of groups them together, they obviously talk about the fossil record. They talk about the patterns of early development, which is, you'll see later, probably maybe in high school or even college. They've got a big fancy word for that. And then the similarities, whether you're talking about physical similarities, similarities in DNA or protein, and they've got a big fancy word for that, homology. And so let's begin taking a look at those. We won't get to the fossil record today. We'll save that for kind of its own lesson. But again, when you might see this expression in high school, definitely in college. Ontogeny recapitulates phylogeny. And that's, wow, what is that? Well, the first word is talking about the development of individual organisms. That is the process that we go through as we develop, especially are they thinking about in the womb or the embryo, the process that it goes through. Recapitulate means simply to summarize the main points of something. And so it's kind of recreating its evolutionary history is again the thought. And the last word again does talk about that, the history of the evolution of a group of species. And so again, going back to Jonathan's biology book, it says the organisms in figure 1 look similar during the early stages of development. All 4 organisms have a tail. They also have a row of tiny slits around their throats. Similarities suggest that these vertebrate species are related and share a common ancestor. And this is the figure that they're talking about on that particular page. And so they've got a chicken, fish, and a turtle, and at different stages of development in this case in the egg, and you see the pig, and you see supposedly the similarities there between those different species. Another textbook says that scientists in the 1700s were fascinated by the fact that various animals looked similar in the earliest stages of life. The adult stages of many species do not look similar. For example, a rabbit does not look anything like a chicken. However, study reveals that the early life stages of a chicken and a rabbit are similar. Again, they've got a picture on that page to show that. High school textbook, again, talks about it. It has pictures and talks about the gill slits. And so we supposedly go through the stage of as a fish early in development. The fellow that came up with these drawings was named Ernst Haeckel, and he lived in Germany. Again, had influence on Hitler, as we talked about a couple of weeks ago. And he kind of came up with this phrase. Again, he was a good artist, so he kind of drew pictures. And an article in American Biology Teacher talks about that this particular drawing, this picture of Haeckel's, is the single most published illustration in biology texts. And again, that goes back many, many years. And yet, everybody today recognizes that it was fraud. It's forgery. It's not true. Here's the actual pictures that Haeckel drew. And when you compare those drawings with the actual photograph, you can see there's quite a bit of difference. Here's the fish, here's the salamander, here's the tortoise, chick, and finally humans. And so scientists that were involved in studying embryology recognize that what Haeckel drew really doesn't represent the actual creature in embryo form. Stephen Jay Gould, well-known evolutionist, he was a professor at Harvard for a number of years and developed kind of his own theory. Niles Eldridge, he received Humanist of the Year Award in 2001. He was a witness at the McLean, Arkansas trial over whether, again, teaching creationism in schools in Arkansas was right or not. And the lawyer, this subject again came up, and the lawyer asked him, what is it? Would explain for everyone what this is. He says it's a history of the current status that old individuals in the course of their growth and embryology repeat the evolutionary stages of their ancestors. It's not true, but it was historically an important point. And so the lawyer says that that concept has been discredited at this point, to which he answered yes. A little year before that, in an article in Natural History, he says it was kind of a basis for, again, the racism that we talked about, again, as a fruit of evolution. An online textbook today says that recapitulationism became one of the central paradigms of biology, but the idea today, embryology was being dismissed. It said in the early 1920s, it was no longer a major support for evolutionary biology. It was described as a lawless science. And yet, there it is, still in the textbooks. In 1925, in the Scopes trial, there's only one actual scientist that testified on the stand at the Scopes trial, but the judge allowed numerous written testimony in from several other scientists which they had brought in. And again, this particular scientist didn't testify, but he had the written testimony. He talks about those gill slits and says earlier stages still show the primitive conditions of a fish-like organization. And yet today we know that those pouches have nothing to do with respiration. The first pair become the cavity of the middle ear, auditory tube. The second pair become the tonsils. The third and fourth become the thymus and a pair of thyroid glands. And so, again, it's obvious, as Stephen Jay Gould said, it's really defunct. It should not be used. And yet it is used today. But again, based on what scientists today are saying, I think we can throw that one out as evidence for evolution. Any questions about that before we go on to the next one? All right, let's think about homology. And again, that big fancy word, but it simply means the similarity of structures or functions, parts of different organs based on their descent, again, supposedly a common ancestor. This particular subject is kind of a broad category. And you may actually see, again, listed in various biology textbooks, a number of so-called evidences for evolution. They may talk about classification, they may talk about comparative anatomy, they may talk about embryology, biogeography, but really behind all of those is this idea of homology, is the idea of similarity in different items. Again, this is Jonathan's last year's textbook. This similarity provides evidence that these animal groups all evolved from a common ancestor. This is from Dr. Miller and Levine's textbook, high school. It says that the similarities help determine how recently species shared a common ancestor. So again, they're saying this idea of the similarities show that we had a common ancestor. Scientists studying the anatomy of living things have also noticed that many different species share similar structures. This similarity in structure indicates that these organisms shared a common ancestor. And again, they've got a picture there showing some of the similarities. Actually, I think this picture from another high school textbook is actually better. And you'll hear them talk about how that the similarity is that all the forelimbs start out with one bone, they go to two bones, and then usually ending in 5 digits, the horse being the exception there in that particular drawing. And so this textbook talked about, we're not supposed to say anything about creationism in school, but apparently if you want to criticize it, it's okay. It talks about that Darwin really saw problems for creationists because of these similarities. Last sentence there says, surely one design must be superior to the other. And so there should just be, he apparently was saying if God was going to create something perfect, then he didn't need to do it several different ways. Just one would be enough. Darwin came to realize made sense of all these paradoxes. Organisms were a clean slate. The very imperfection of the feeling that so many of them could have been designed came to Darwin the most convincing evidence. And so, and here's what we have. Think about that. We talked about, making distinction between facts and inferences or assumptions that we make from that. And so, again, those are the facts. Those are the limbs and the bones in these different animals. But the evolution says that shows a common ancestor, while the creationist says, why doesn't that show a common design? Something, if you're creating something and you develop it, and then the engineer may come back later and kind of tweak it and make that, or start with basic pattern and make something else from that. So let me see if I can illustrate. Think about cars. This is Rebecca's first car, 1977 Pontiac Ventura. And when I was 16, I wanted a Chevrolet Camaro. And so there's 9 years difference between those two cars, and yet they use the same oil filter, they use the same air filter, and there's probably several other parts that we could say were similar. In fact, you can actually buy books that talk about interchangeable parts for cars. Those was it Bill, Buick, or Ford? And so does that mean they all had a common ancestor, or are we talking about a company that either designed them and used parts again interchangeably as they designed those and manufactured them? A lot of different types of vehicles were used during World War II. You had, again, the kind of the Pontiac Ventura was a pretty good car. Yeah. They had the basic, truck, had the Sherman tank, and if we look hard enough, we might find the common ancestor, right? Something in between. Or again, we could go back to the truck, and they had patrol boats they used, and lo and behold, we might be able to find a common ancestor, right? Or does that show, again, a common manufacturer, a common designer as they created these particular vehicles? It's several years ago when I was at the American Biology Teachers Conference that year it was in Memphis. One of the sessions was on the evolution of the car. So I thought, wow, this is going to be good. And why could we not say that's evidence of a common designer rather than a common ancestor? But they decided to cancel that particular session, so I didn't get to it. But one of the Evolution Education Outreach Journal did have an article on the evolution of the skateboard. So again, you think about that. Does it really, does it really show that there was a common ancestor, or does it talk about common design? And engineers taking something, they find it works good, again, tweaking it, making it a little better, and they create, again, a different kind of model. But again, laying all that aside, there's still problems with the idea, as again different scientists talk about. Development of evidence of homology is problematic. These two scientists say, especially in regard to the origin of birds. Another publication says it is disturbing. Many and deep problems are associated again with this idea. Yet Darwin, in his second major book, The Descent of Man, said that there's ample and conclusive evidence for it. So again, which is correct? Is there disturbing and many deep problems, or is it ample and conclusive evidence that is being offered? Yeah, that is, again, kind of a problem. That's kind of, I think, one big reason why Google came up with his idea to explain that changes were rapid instead of gradual, so that there was kind of a big jump, and you don't see the small changes again in the fossil record. But yeah, that does become kind of a problem if you're just halfway. In the textbooks, y'all know what a cladogram is? One is. It's a kind of diagram that's based on the patterns of shared or derived traits to show again the supposedly relationship that exists. And the old ones were diagonal, like this example here. They, again, science teachers studied the different brackets, and they actually say that this bracket tree is a better way to teach students the concept rather than the diagonal one. But again, the idea is that, you know, here's a vulture and a crocodile, and supposedly they're closer related. The crocodile is to the bird rather than to an elephant or a mammal. And their common ancestor would have been closer than the common ancestor to the elephant, vulture, and the crocodile. And again, so that again is what they're trying to teach. So let's see if we can illustrate. Y'all come up here, all of you. Pick out one that you like. All right. 3 left over. All right, come on up here. Okay, we got different kinds of candy bars. Plus we've got M&Ms, we got Junior Mints. So just thinking about the size of them and what's a big difference that you see. Some have nuts, but think about the size right now. All right, so we got pieces. So all the pieces get on this side. All the bars we'll put right here. All right, so there would be a big split in our bracket that we're creating. Now, so we got bars, we got pieces. Jonathan gave us another difference. What do you got, Jonathan? Snickers. Okay, Snickers has, what you say? Nuts. Does any of those other ones have nuts? Okay, so you take the Snickers and Almond Joy and come down here to the other can. So we made that separation. Could y'all do the same? Okay, you got nuts. Then, so y'all kind of separate a little bit. Put the nuts here and the other two over here. So we're building our bracket. We could actually go farther. Jonathan, what's inside your Snickers? What kind of filling that is? Caramel. What's in the Almond Joy? Never had an Almond Joy. Coconut, something your grandmother doesn't like. And we could do the same here. What's inside the M&M? Yeah, milk chocolate. What's inside Junior Mints? Okay, peppermint. So you kind of see how we could build that chart. So what's the common ancestor? Sugar. All right, we got kind of big items, the bars, then we got small round items. So we need something kind of big and something that's round. So I think we'd have to say that the peppermint patty must be the common ancestor, right? Does everybody agree with that? So you think that's sound evidence that this has got to be the common ancestor? What happens if we throw Skittles in the mix? All right. Y'all can sit down. You can keep the candy, by the way. So, here's actually a chart that proves everything. So if you ever need to do anything, here's one graph that establishes everything. You know, on that Snickers bar was the word absurd, so maybe that's kind of what we're getting to. You know, it's one thing to say, here's proof of something, but is it really? Or are you really, you know, you made a nice chart, you made a nice graph, but are your inferences that we talked about again, is that really true? Now, closely related to that is the idea of the similarities in DNA or in genes. And we'll see that, again, you know, when evolution first started, they didn't know anything about DNA. And so they based all their assumptions on just as we did here. Just, you know, how does things look? And made those separations and divisions. Molecular similarity is one of the strongest lines of evidence, supposedly, for evolution. And this is one of the hardest difficulty for students to grasp. We looked at, again, that definition, and their illustration on that page is this. Talk about the similarities again in DNA. And so the little yellow squares are the differences that you see between an aster and a tomato, snapdragon, and rice. And because there's less differences between the tomato and aster, they say they've got to be, you know, they have got to have a closer common ancestor than the tomato and rice, or the snapdragon. So, kind of keep up with our illustration, let's look at the ingredients of our candy bars or our other candy. Obviously, M&Ms and M&M nuts with peanuts, there's only one difference. So let's look at, again, M&Ms and Snickers. And you see there's really quite a bit of similarity, right, between M&Ms and Snickers. But compare that then to the Junior Mints. There's not a whole lot similar. And yet, where did we have Junior Mints? It was over here with what? M&Ms, right? Yeah, easy. And so if we're going by the physical evidence, the way it looks, we've got it grouped way over here, when really, if we look at the internal ingredients, they're not related, or at least they're way different than looking at the physical side. And that's true, again, when it comes to grouping from an evolution standpoint. Again, this Jonathan's textbook says evidence from DNA and protein structures has confirmed conclusions based on fossils, embryos, and body structure. For example, DNA comparisons show that dogs are more similar to wolves than to coyotes. Scientists have already reached this conclusion based on similarities in the structure and development of these three species. So there's the physical side. This other textbook talks about scientists can tell how closely organized our organisms are related by comparing their DNA. The more matches there are in the sequence bases between two organisms, the more closely related they are. And so they talk about mouse and human. And again, this is the chart they have on that page, and little bars in green, probably hard for you to see, are again showing the differences. this book also says, again, the primary tools early scientists use for taxonomy, again, classifying, grouping, were their eyes and measuring devices. And so they did like we did at first with the chocolates, and we grouped them again kind of based on appearance. And so all this, they're going to say, all this physical evidence helps scientists see that all living things are related by evolution. Some are more closely related than others. This means they share a more recent ancestor. Let's look at that statement. They talk about physical evidence. So there's fact. The candy bars are bars. They're long-shaped M&Ms around. That's a fact. We can see that, we can observe it. But to say that means that living organisms are related by evolution, or they share a more common ancestor, those are assumptions. Those are inferences they want to make, again, based on just the similarity that we see. But when you bring genetic evidence in, genetic evidence usually supports physical evidence, they say, but not always. So they give an example here. The red panda compared to the giant panda. And if you're just looking at them, again, from a physical standpoint, you might say, they kind of look alike, they're similar. But then when you examine the DNA, they're not similar. The red panda is closer to, there's more similarity between it and the raccoon than the panda. And so when you bring in genetics, you've got scientists that talk about that this really turns taxonomy on its head. So again, we're back to where we're saying, which one's correct. The textbook says genetic evidence usually supports physical evidence, where the scientist says DNA coding is turning taxonomy on its head. And, even if you would take this idea, it usually supports, well, how reliable can you say about your conclusions if it only usually is right? Doesn't that say something about the argument or the jump that you're trying to make? If you say, well, usually the Almond Joy and the Three Musketeers, they look like they're related. They're close together. But again, when you examine the ingredients, they're not really close together. One scientist talked about the frustration of this particular problem. He says what's frustrating is not being able to merge the fossil evidence and the genetic evidence. Fossil evidence would be what you're seeing as, again, you're observing. So again, we get back to the idea of what we're talking about between facts and conclusions that we're making, or assumptions we're making from that. If you're arguing that similarity shows a common ancestor, again, as you observe things physically, and then all of a sudden when you look at the DNA, it shows that's completely wrong. Again, that red panda is more like a raccoon than a panda. Doesn't that say something about your argument and how reliable that may be? That's, I think, what we need to keep in mind. You'll hear the expression, especially as they're considering DNA and the genes, molecular clock. And this basically is the changes between a gene or a strand of DNA and supposedly the time that's been involved from, like we talked about the tomato. Okay, say there's 3 differences between it and the snapdragon. And so how long did it take for those 3 mutations or differences to take place? And they look at, mutations today, and they figure up a rate, and they say, okay, that helps us to see how long it took for the snapdragon and the tomato to evolve from their supposed common ancestor. And so on this page, again, their chart, we'll talk about, well, for example, we talked about humans being related to mice. And so, they look at the differences and say, well, based on this mutation rate, they had a common ancestor, about 75 million years ago. But the cow and the human, of course, there's more differences. So that would probably be about 100 million years ago. The human, the kangaroo, is even more differences. So that's kind of where they get that. But in this particular article, some scientists reviewed that concept and that idea of the molecular clock. And they said, we document the manner in which a calibration point that is both inaccurate and inexact, and in many instances inapplicable and irrelevant, has been used to produce an exhaustive evolutionary timeline that is enticing but totally imaginary. So how much confidence do you have in the molecular clock? They go on to say that despite their allure, we must sadly conclude that all divergence estimates discussed here are without merit. Our advice to the reader is, whenever you see a time estimate in the evolutionary literature, demand uncertainty. And so, yeah, they've taken assumptions, how long it takes these mutations, and they've made estimates then on how long the animals had their common ancestor. But these fellows say, it's really uncertain. You really can't put a lot of confidence in it. Yeah, there's the different characteristics are different, even in what we would say we're closer species. Go back to dogs. There's obviously differences, though in that case they may have had and did have a common ancestor. But again, it's not the macroevolution as talked about again a while ago. So even with the genetic similarities, again, there's still scientists that talk about how that they can be deceiving in the results that you're looking at. Even talk about how it contradicted at least one time, and this does not mean that they all are incorrect. And so here again, I'm trying to make an argument, and I'm admitting that yeah, sometimes it's it's not right, but that doesn't mean it's always not right. So how much confidence can I put into that kind of reasoning, kind of argument? Quickly, let's talk about the vestigial structures. These are usually organs or other parts of the body that they say is remaining as the last small part of something that existed before. And so vestigial organs are physical structures that were fully developed and functional in the ancestral group of organisms that now are reduced and unused in later species. In the bodies of whales, there's small leg bones, they're vestigial. The skeleton of snakes also have traces of lay-like structures that are not used. And again, you look and usually, nearly the one that every textbook talks about is the appendix. And again, it's interesting to go back to the Scopes trial and see what was argued there. And the scientist there that was talking about this said there's no less than 180 vestigial structures in the human body, and that makes man a walking museum of antiquity. But if you go and look today, how many are there? Well, on the Natural Museum of Natural History, they only give 5. That's the muscles that cause goosebumps, body hair, the tailbone, wisdom teeth, and appendix. And when you even look at those, we're coming to realize they are important. Jonathan lost his appendix, but that was really, it is beneficial. We do have beneficial bacteria in our colon, and when we have a bad case of diarrhea or something, it needs to be replaced. And so that was kind of the role of the appendix. The tailbone has a lot of important muscles attached to it that hold things in. So that's kind of important. So even if we maybe don't know the reason or can figure out why something is important, how we use that today, that doesn't mean that we don't need it or that it's some leftover organ again from some creature that we supposedly had a common ancestor with many years ago. And so again, we've looked at 2 of those. Next time, I won't be here next week. And then I think the week after that's the race. So probably about 3 weeks before we get back talking about, and we'll look at the fossil record as the other so-called evidence for evolution. Any questions before we close out? Yeah, it's either true or false, right? 2 + 2 = 4. Well, there's really kind of 2 types of science. There is what we might call, I don't want to use the word factual, but there are things that are definite. I mean, we know the Earth's round, like Bill and I was talking about. We know that there's gravity. And so those are items that, you know, we recognize as true. But if you're looking at something that you can't really either observe, you know, science is supposed to be things we observe, but obviously it's not if we're talking about evolution. Things that supposedly took place in the past, again, we can't observe those. We can't test those as you can with other items. And so really there's two branches of science. And it depends on, again, what you're talking about, whether or not it is really provable, like math, or whether it's based, again, upon assumptions that are made. Yeah. Wait, I can't. Y'all be quiet on the back. I can't hear. Go ahead. Yeah. Yeah, they're used in reproduction. So ask the whale if that's important or not. Yeah. Yeah, that's good. There's actually an article in National Geographic that talks about, again, the purpose of those bones supposedly that were left over in the whale. All right, so we better stop there. Appreciate your attention.